All right. Well, you turn there. John chapter 6. I love the Gospel of John. And if you were just asking me my favorite book of the Bible or what it's been over the years, John would probably be the answer to that question. And I know that's true for a lot of people. Part of the reason I love John so much is John's just so clear about what he's trying to accomplish in giving us the gospel. Because in John chapter 20, verse 31, at the end of this gospel, he simply writes this, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." And the simple mission that John seems to set out to accomplish is this. He wants you to believe in Jesus. He wants you to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. But beyond that, here's the promise that John offers. If you'll believe, you'll have life. And I think if you asked most people what they're looking for, kind of that vague notion of life would be a helpful way of defining that. That all of us would say what we want most right now maybe is purpose or joy or meaning or contentment or however you might define a full and satisfied life. And as we look at the end of the Gospel of John, this should be an encouraging thing to us because what he seems to be saying is this. Everything that you're looking for, you can find in believing in Jesus. Now, it's in phrasing it like that John 20:31 actually causes some problems for a lot of us. Because here's my guess, and I know this has often been true of me in my relationship with Jesus. There are times I would admit, I am believing in Jesus. I do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. But I don't feel like I'm living out of the life that's promised here. I wouldn't say I'm experiencing life in the full sense that John wants us to experience it or that Jesus wants us to experience it. And so really the question I want to tackle this morning is simply this. What causes the disconnect for many of us between believing in Jesus but not experiencing the full, satisfied life that's supposed to come on the back end of that? Maybe you're here this morning and you don't believe in Jesus. And honestly, one of the reasons you've questioned why you should even bother is because you look at the lives of the Christians around you and say, they don't seem any, discernibly happier than me, more content than me, more satisfied than me. Why should I believe in Jesus if there doesn't seem to be a tangible benefit to it? And that's a good question to ask. And so as we get into John 6 today, here's the question we're going after. What's the disconnect? Why can I believe in Jesus and not experience life? And then how do we bridge that gap? What does it look like to believe in Jesus in such a way that we find the life promised in John chapter 20? So John 6, we're going to get into this morning. We're going to start in verse 1. The other Gospels tell us that as we open John 6, Jesus has been preaching to crowds. Now, one of the reasons we know this particular story, Jesus feeding the 5,000, was an important story to those who saw and witnessed the ministry of Jesus is this. It's the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels. All four Gospels said, this is important enough, we need to tell people about this. And so in John chapter 6, Jesus is teaching, and this session has been going on for several hours, and several thousand people have gathered, and the question comes up, how are we going to feed all these people? Wasn't a first century dining court they could send everybody to. Okay, not a lot of business casual options in Capernaum at the time. And so they're in the desert, they're with Jesus, everyone's hungry, and there doesn't seem to be any food. And so Jesus asks Philip, one of his disciples, what should we do? Philip doesn't know what to do because there was 5,000 to 15,000 people there. And then in verse 8, Peter makes a suggestion that seems kind of silly when we read it. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? And you can imagine most of the disciples thinking, what a dumb suggestion to make because there's 15,000 people here. And we have a couple pieces of fish and we have a couple loaves of bread. And John even makes the point it's barley bread, which at the time it was low quality bread. It wasn't even good food that they had. And so what help could this be? But Jesus tells the disciples, have the people sit. And then we're told in John chapter 6, somehow from a few loaves of bread, a few fish, Jesus abundantly feeds thousands of people. And we know it's abundant because everybody eats their fill, and then he tells the disciples, go pick up the leftovers, and there's 12 large baskets of leftovers collected. Jesus didn't just give, it wasn't like they were flying on an airplane. Here's your crackers, here's your soda. It was, here's as much food as you want, and there's 12 large baskets left over. And miraculously, he feeds these thousands of people. And I want you to put yourself in the crowd for a moment. What's your response to this miracle of Jesus? Okay. You would probably begin to think some pretty incredible things about him. And John tells us what the crowd was thinking. Verse 14, the crowd sees this happen. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who's come into the world. Now, it's important they said the prophet. They're not saying Jesus is a prophet, he's the prophet. And if you were in the crowd on that day, you were probably thinking of something like Deuteronomy chapter 18 as you saw this. Because in Deuteronomy 18:15, God makes this promise to his people. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking, from among you. From your brothers, it is to him you shall listen. And even at the time of Moses, Moses told the people of God, God's going to send a prophet like me, a prophet greater than me, that you will listen to someday. And most people believe this would be the Messiah. And so for hundreds of years, people had been asking the question, when's God going to send the prophet? When's God going to send this promised prophet? And the crowd sees Jesus feed thousands, and their response is, this is the prophet we've been waiting for since Deuteronomy chapter 18. Some big beliefs they're having about Jesus here. And on the surface, this is a great thing, right? It looks like revival's breaking out. It seems like they understand who Jesus is, that you would think Jesus would be excited about this, that if they had social media, the disciples would be posting pictures of all the people responding. Look at what broke out in our ministry today. And yet verse 15 is pretty unexpected, because here's Jesus' response to their belief. 6:15, perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So here's three dots we're trying to connect that seem at odds with each other. Jesus performs the miracle. The people recognize Jesus is the prophet. Jesus is king. Jesus is the one we want to be in charge. And yet Jesus sees their belief about him and withdraws from the crowd. He keeps them at a distance. And again, this seems like a weird reaction for Jesus to have, because the crowd seems to believe in Jesus. Many of us, we profess faith in Jesus, and yet Jesus seems to suggest in John chapter 6, there's a kind of belief in Jesus that isn't the belief in Jesus that Jesus is looking for. And that might not make sense, but we're going to try and unpack that. That there's different ways of believing in Jesus. And Jesus saw something deficient in the way that the crowds were responding to him. And that's why he kept them at a distance here in John chapter 6. Again, as we try and figure out what's happening here, one of the questions we have to walk back and ask underneath this is, when we say we believe in Jesus, what do we mean? And when the crowd said they believe in Jesus, what did they mean? There's a way of believing in Jesus that goes something like this. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I believe that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was an important moment in human history. And yet, you can believe facts about Jesus and it never change anything about you. You can believe things about Jesus like you believe facts in a textbook and intellectually agree with them, and yet it doesn't change anything about who you are or how you live. Or there's kind of this base level belief in Jesus that's possible that doesn't work itself out into a changed life. James, the brother of Jesus, knew this. He writes in James 2:19, you believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe that and shudder. And he seems to suggest that there's a kind of belief in God that's not any different than the way Satan may believe about God, or the thoughts that demons may have about God. They know who he is. They know where Jesus came from. They know Jesus' identity, and yet they've decided to live, in a way at odds with those beliefs. And maybe if this isn't making sense, there's a lot of things most of us believe or agree with that doesn't lead to change in our lives, okay? It's possible to believe something's true and not act on it. I'm sure most of us believe, a healthy diet and regular exercise are good for us. It's another thing for that to lead to action. Most of us can believe there's better uses to my time than binge watching something on Netflix, and just when the next episode pops up, to keep pushing the button and keep watching. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but you can believe something's true and yet choose not to act on it. Some of you probably believe that, if I go to class, I'm likely to get a better grade. And you believe that as an idea. And probably can't recognize some of your professors, okay? And it's possible. I believe this is true, but I don't act on it. And Jesus understood there's a way of believing in Jesus. And here's what he understood about the crowd. Where they could believe some things about him were true and yet not be on a place where that was causing them to step out in faith. They didn't believe in a way that would force them to change how they viewed themselves, how they viewed their lives, and at the end of the day, they didn't believe in a way that would require them to step out in faith as they're following Jesus. There's actually a way to summarize, I think, the problem Jesus has with the crowd, and honestly, the issue he's probably had with me at points in my life, and it's simply this. The crowd believed some things about Jesus, but they weren't ready to trust him yet. They believed some facts about Jesus, but weren't willing to step out in faith yet. And when you read the word faith in the Bible, one of the things we've lost is we should often think trust when we read that word. That I think we put faith in the realm of beliefs that we have, but when you talk about trust, that's a day-by-day thing. That's something that requires action, and that would have been a part of the way they would have understood faith. And so Jesus sees faith as this active trusting in Him, in His Word, in His example, not just keeping things in the realm of intellectual beliefs about Jesus. So the question we want to ask with the crowd is this: what is it that kept them from moving from belief to trust? And the question we want to ask for ourselves is, what keeps us from moving from belief to trust? Because I think the answer to that question that we asked at the beginning of this sermon, what keeps us from believing in such a way that we experience the life that Jesus promised, is that move from belief of intellectual facts about Jesus to day-by-day trust in Jesus in a relationship. But there were some things holding the people back from that. The first one is this: the people were unwilling to trust Jesus because they were unwilling to let Jesus tell them what they needed. They thought they knew what they needed. They weren't willing to let Jesus diagnose their problem. Look what the crowd says once they find Jesus. So Jesus feeds the 5,000. A day goes by. The crowd is searching for him because of the miracle he performed. And here's one of the first things they say to him. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you're seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." And what Jesus tells the crowd here is this: I know why you're searching for me. You're searching for me because I gave you food to eat. You're searching for me because of what I could provide for you, which on the surface doesn't seem like a bad thing. But Jesus, what we begin to see in John 6 is this: the people want to follow Jesus because he gave them bread to eat, and Jesus wanted to do so much more for them than that, but they were unwilling to go there with him. And so they were asking for so little of him. I think it's fair to say that many in the crowd on that day saw Jesus something like, these weren't around at the time, but had they known, saw something like a vending machine. And I go to Jesus to give me what I want, and I go to Jesus to give me what I want. And the reason they're searching for him is this: we were hungry, and you fed us. We have needs, and you can meet them. And if we can assess our own hearts for a second, it's really easy for me to fall into this. That when I look at the prayers that I pray, that when I look at the ways that I think about Jesus, that often I'm tempted to see Jesus as the means to an end, one of the ways to get what I really want out of this life, rather than Jesus as the thing that I really want out of this life. And that's the issue that the crowd was wrestling with here. Again, I see it in my own life that I go to Jesus for. Jesus, give me the things that will finally make me happy. I need a relationship. I need a certain amount of income. I need a certain job or status or position. I need certain circumstances in this life to make me happy and comfortable and that are convenient. And however you might fill in that blank, Jesus, I'll finally be happy when. And we go to Jesus as maybe the best way to give me what I need to be satisfied in this life. I'm clear about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying don't go to Jesus and tell him your needs and your wants. He says, come to me like a child and ask for the things that are on your heart. And so it's not wrong to ask Jesus for things, but it's wrong to see Jesus as the means to the thing that will actually satisfy me, because what we miss in that is this, is that we're going to the person who can actually satisfy us to give us things that won't actually satisfy us. And it's in that we miss the life that was promised here. Katie Ziegler, who's a writer for InterVarsity, I think put it well when she said, this seems obvious, but it's worth naming. We shouldn't treat Jesus like a vending machine because he's the Lord of the universe and we're not. Does it strike anyone else as supremely narcissistic that we act as if we can order Jesus to do anything and expect him to obey us? This is an issue of posturing. Jesus has certainly invited us to offer him our prayers, which includes the desires of our hearts, but these prayers are part of a relationship with him, and we're not the boss of him, and he's the boss of us. And yet, when we demand things of Jesus, we're not only assuming that we know what's best, we're also implying that we are in control of him in some way. And here's where this becomes a problem. When I think of Jesus as this thing that gives me what I want, okay, go back to the vending machine metaphor. And I come to the vending machine and I begin to put my money in to get what I want. And often we don't think about it in these terms, but here's what we're doing. I'm coming to Jesus and Jesus knows the things I've done for him. And so I've been in church lately and I drop a coin in, and I've read my Bible lately and I drop a coin in, and I've done good things for people and I drop a coin in. And we come to Jesus with this mindset of, I've done enough good things to justify you giving me what I want. And then you ask Jesus for something and he doesn't respond, he doesn't answer. And if that's our view of Jesus, that Jesus is there to give me what I need, and he doesn't respond, one of two things typically happens. Either you walk away from the faith altogether because you feel like Jesus has let you down, or you set Jesus to the side as something that might be helpful some of the time, but something that's not trustworthy all of the time. And yet part of what we miss when we approach Jesus like this is that, Jesus, this is what I need. Jesus, give me what I need. What we miss is maybe Jesus has good reasons for not giving us what we need in the moment, or what we think we need in the moment. That as we look back, what if God has you facing difficult circumstances right now because that's where you need to be to grow as close to him as you can? When I look back on my life, the times I've gotten closest to Jesus are often the times I was praying to him, take away the circumstances I'm in. But it was in the midst of those circumstances I was more dependent on Jesus than I had ever been. It was in the midst of those difficult circumstances I saw my weakness. I saw how inadequate I was to deal with the problems of this life. And these things I prayed to God, God, take these circumstances away, were actually the very moments in my life where Jesus was doing the greater work in me. And yet if I was in charge, I never would have dealt with any of those things. What if he has you facing difficult circumstances right now because on the other side of it, you'll be able to minister to others facing the same thing? Again, something I wouldn't ask for, but something he's going to use in the future. Or maybe Jesus is simply holding something back from us because he knows in the end it would be worse to give it to us right now. And I know I can look back on prayers I prayed, passionate prayers I prayed. Jesus, please give me this. And a year later, looking back, thinking, I'm so glad Jesus didn't give me that. And we begin to see that he is our good father. And sometimes good fathers say no, but that requires us to take a posture when we come to Jesus that says, I'm okay trusting that he does know what is best, that he is going to work and move for my good. But that's not the approach I can bring if the approach I bring to Jesus is there to ultimately give me what I think I need. If we're willing to trust Jesus, we can hear no from him and not lose heart. We can endure when our faith doesn't seem to make sense, or the things that we want aren't in our lives. And that's one of the things that we have to think through as we move from belief to trust is, what's the posture I bring to Jesus? That Jesus is ultimately there to serve me, or that I'm ultimately there to serve Jesus? And that's a step the crowds weren't willing to take yet. There's a second issue, though. And as we look at what the crowds were struggling with when it came to faith in Jesus, part of the problem was they simply weren't willing to trust him as far as Jesus was calling them to trust. And we see this skip all the way down to verse 48. So this conversation's happening between Jesus and the crowd, and they're struggling to believe. They just want Jesus to give them stuff, and yet Jesus is calling them to more than that. And then verse 48, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I'm the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever, and the bread I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Here's what I love about Jesus. They're confused by what Jesus is saying. And Jesus doesn't stop and say, all right, let me break this down for you. He doubles down and makes it weirder, okay? Because what in the world does he mean? So Jesus said to them, verse 53, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I'll raise him up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. And Jesus, in effect, says, you're following me because you want me to give you bread. I am the bread you're looking for. I am the thing that will satisfy the desire that you have. You think it's in what I can give you. I can give you myself, and I am the thing that will satisfy you. And he says it in weird language that's hard to understand, eating my flesh and drinking my blood. We actually have things written in the first century where non-Christians were saying we should do something about these Christians because apparently there's cannibalism in their worship services, and it seems like we should deal with this. They're becoming a problem. And so why does Jesus use language like this? And part of what we begin to discover is this. Part of our problem in understanding the metaphor Jesus is using is just we live at a different time than when Jesus was teaching. It's hard for us to understand. Why do we eat? Why do we drink? For those in the first century, they understood food and drink as this. We need this every day to survive. And if I don't work, I'm not going to have money. And if I don't have money, I can't get food and water for my family. And we're not going to be able to survive unless we have food and drink every day. And we miss that because we don't have that day-to-day relationship with trying to find things to give us sustenance. And yet, what Jesus is trying to tell them is this. You're depending on this food and this drink to sustain you. What it looks like to really trust in me is this, that I'm the thing that's constantly sustaining you. I'm the thing you're feeding on. I'm the thing that's giving you life. And again, as we see this, many of those in the crowd listening to Jesus, they understood food and drink is what they needed to survive. And Jesus is calling them to this. You think you need the bread I can give you. What you need is me. And again, many in the crowd weren't willing to go there with him yet. And so this brings us to a question we have to ask this year. Are we willing to move from belief in facts about Jesus to Jesus as the thing that sustains me moment by moment and day by day? That without the grace of God every day when I wake up, I need that to sustain me, to empower my life with God, to do the kinds of things that God has called me to do. Are we willing to believe that even if Jesus never gave me any of the things I think I need for a happy and satisfied life, I can have a happy and satisfied life because I have Him? It's a hard place to move. But Scripture's clear with us because it gives us stories like Job and it gives us books like Lamentations to say, just because you make a decision to worship God does not mean life will be easy. That sometimes we get tricked into this idea that one of the reasons I should follow Jesus is life will be more comfortable with Jesus, and often life gets a lot harder with Jesus. But life gets a lot harder while, if our trust is in Jesus, providing us with the thing that everybody's searching for. We're all searching for something to satisfy us, something to make us content, something to sustain us deep down. And what Jesus offers is this. I won't provide that for you because I am that thing. You can find that in a closer relationship with me. But as we think about what this looks like, again, Jesus may not give you everything that you want, but He seems very ready in John chapter 6 to give you everything that you need in order to experience the life that He wants you to experience. Kind of foundational to this is what He said when He said, I give my life, this bread, as for the life of the world, that Jesus gives Himself for us, that Jesus understood the thing that we're searching for. All of us are searching for something. And we search in different places and we search in different ways, but we're searching for this deep longing that we have inside of us that we can't seem to satisfy, and we're jumping from thing to thing and person to person. Something has to fill this gap, and yet Jesus understood, I know what it is. You're looking for a relationship with God because that's what you were made for. And yet the very thing we were made for, we can't get on our own because we rebelled against God, we've sinned against God, we've separated ourselves from God, that the judgment of God is rightly on us. But Jesus says, I give my life for the life of the world. That here's what Jesus was willing to provide for the people. Not the physical bread that they were seeking every day. But He says, what I'll provide for you is my life. I'll take the punishment you deserved. I'll live the perfect obedience to God that you could never live. I'll give you my righteousness. I'll offer you forgiveness of sins. I'll restore your relationship with God. That hole you feel in the pit of your stomach, I'll satisfy that by reconnecting you to God. But what that requires of us is a willingness to come to Jesus and say, I need you to do what I can't do for myself. I need you to do for me what I can't do for myself. And the longer I'm a pastor, I'm more convinced of this. What keeps most people from Jesus isn't intellectual opposition to Christianity that they can't get over. And what keeps people from Jesus isn't they can't understand how the gospel works. The hardest obstacle for most people to get over when it comes to a relationship with Jesus is this. In order for me to trust Jesus, in order for me to believe in Jesus, in order for me to get close to Jesus, I have to be willing to admit He can do something for me I can't do for myself. And in a culture that idolizes being self-sufficient, grinding to get what you want, putting in work to receive a reward, it's so hard for us to admit there's something I can't do myself. There's a mountain I can't climb. There's a goal I can't reach no matter how hard I work. And it's that pride within us that as Jesus calls the crowds to follow Him, let me do what only I can do for you, that keeps most of them at a distance. And as we're going to see here in the next verse, actually causes many who have just seen Jesus feed thousands of people with this small lunch to turn away from Him because they weren't ready to go there with Him yet. John 6:66. After this, many of His disciples turned back and no longer walked with Him. Now think about that. How many of us have said in our minds, if I could see Jesus perform a miracle, I'd have no problem believing? Most of these people just saw Jesus do something more miraculous than any of us will ever see, maybe than anyone had seen in the Bible. And yet after His teaching, they turn and walk away. Why? Because they weren't ready to trust Him in the ways that Jesus was calling them to trust yet. That they stopped short because, again, it's that willingness to admit that not only do I have to believe in Jesus to follow Him, I have to be dependent on Jesus. I have to be desperate on Jesus. I need Jesus to sustain me and make me right with God because I can't do it myself. And so we get confronted with the same question the crowds were confronted with. Are we ready to move from belief to trust? And that's the question, I think, for City of God this year. Are we ready to move from right doctrine to day by day trusting in Jesus, in a relationship with Him, knowing that without His presence and grace, we would have no hope at all? And again, that's a wonderful thing when you can get there, and it requires the help of God, but it also requires us to be able to say, I don't have it all together. I can't figure this out. I need Jesus to do things for me I can't do myself. And that, again, is one of the biggest obstacles for people to come over as it comes to believing the gospel. And so Jesus sees the crowds leaving, and He turns to His disciples and asks a question. For one of the rare times you can say this in the Gospels, Jesus asks a question, and Peter actually nails the answer. Verse 67, you never know what He's going to say. This was good. Jesus said to the 12, do you want to go away as well? Simon Peter answered Him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Here's what Peter understood. Trusting Jesus wasn't easy. He just said some weird stuff. They didn't entirely understand it. Okay? But Peter knew this. Even when I don't understand what Jesus is saying or why He's saying it or why He's asking me what He's asking me to do, there's nowhere else I can find the kind of life that Jesus offers anywhere other than in Him. And so the question we want to ask as we close today, and the band can come up, is this. What would moving from belief to trust look like for you this year? What would it look like to begin to experience the sustaining work of Jesus day by day in your life this year? That for some of you, it might simply be this, and it might be the starting place. You've been in church for years, and you still believe that being right with God is on you and how good you are. And your faith exhausts you because deep down you really believe, unless I figure it all out, unless I get it all together, unless I do enough good stuff, unless I earn God's favor and happiness, I can never rest in what God thinks about me. And part of learning to trust Jesus this year is this learning to trust that what Jesus says about you is true, not because of the things you've done, but because of what He's done for you. Again, that's a hard move to make because, I know for someone like me, one of the hardest things to believe is what God says is true about me is actually true about me, because everything else in my life, I've taught myself to believe I am what I can do for other people. I am my accomplishments. I am the status that I can earn. And yet Jesus calls us to come and know you are what God says is true about you, because I've already done everything to take care of that. That maybe for some of us, learning to trust Jesus more this year is learning to trust His words And yes, I believe true things about Jesus, but I don't go to his words asking, Jesus, shape what my life looks like, shape what my priorities look like, shape what I'm pursuing this life, and what's most important to me. That often the struggle most of us have is this. We come to Jesus with the foundation of our life already set. And I know what my priorities are going to be. I know what my schedule is going to be. I know the things I'm pursuing. I know what's most important. I know what I want to get out of this life and what I'm looking for. And we kind of fill that box of what we want our life to look like. And we kind of sprinkle Jesus on top. And where he can fit in with our plan, he can fit in with our plan. But rather trusting Jesus is calling us to say, I've got this whiteboard with what my life should look like on it. And I'm wiping it clean. And I'm giving Jesus the marker saying, you set the course for everything. You give me my priorities, give me my mission, give me the things that should be important to me, give me the things my life should be about. And again, that's a much different posture, having Jesus on the side to get me out of a jam when I don't know what else to do, and saying, Jesus, set the course for everything about who I am and what I do and what I'm about in the coming year. Or maybe feeding on Jesus more this year means simply this. Being able to come to him and say, Jesus, you're the thing at the center. Being able to come and simply repent of, Jesus, I'm sorry for how self-sufficient I've tried to be, and realizing how much grace from God we've missed out on by simply being unwilling to ask. And so again, as we press into this, again, that's a hard decision to make. It means letting go of some things that are important to us. It means letting go of some dreams that we have. It means letting go maybe of our to-do list and letting Jesus rewrite it. But if we're willing to do that, we might not get the life that we wanted. We might not get the life we've asked Jesus for. But here's the promise we find in the Gospel of John. When you approach Jesus with that kind of trust, believing that he's the Son of God and acting on that belief, life may not be easy, may not be comfortable, may not be convenient. You will find life. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank you so much for this morning and our time together.